Ambulance service. Is the patient breathing?
Barely.
Okay, is he breathing right now, though?
Is he breathing, Tom? He keeps taking big dark breaths. Basically, my 6-year-old stepson is falling, he's banged his head.
Okay.
And while he was on the floor, he's banged his head another 5 times.
Okay.
This woman we just heard calling 911 is the stepmother of Arthur Labinjo Hughes, the little 6-year-old boy who had been abused, starved, and not allowed to receive any kind of love. So if you thought this was a desperate 911 call from a loving mother, then you're dead wrong. The young boy Arthur was forced to sleep on the floor in the living room when his dad, Thomas Hughes, and stepmother, Emma Tustin, are laying upstairs in a warm bed. The 6-year-old was so weak he could hardly stand. Arthur was starving and looking for someone to help him and give him some love.
He had every costume and action figure and would spend hours dressing up and pretending he had all their superpowers.
About a year ago, Arthur was a little happy boy. He loved superheroes and football. Other people describe him as a very sweet, bubbly boy. Arthur was living with his mother and father. He had bright eyes, was full of life and a joy to all. But then his parents separated after his mother was sent to prison, and Arthur was forced to live with his father and stepmother, Emma Tustin. And that was the beginning of the end. Little Arthur's life turned upside down until he took his final breath just at the age of 6. The pain of his premature death, evident in all those who loved him. To understand why this happened, we must go back to the beginning, where it all started. Thomas Hughes found love again after saying goodbye to Arthur's biological mother. He started dating Emma Tustin, who had 4 children on her own. But while she seemed motherly and affectionate, it turned out that Emma was not so thrilled to be taking care of little Arthur, and she did not relent in showing that in how she treated the little boy. There were several reported incidents of how she maltreated him and made his life a living hell.
It's hard to say where the first indications of physical abuse came. Certainly there was an occasion where Arthur told one of his uncles that she had pushed him against a wall. Other relatives noticed that while she treated her other children really well.
As time went by, it turned out that she had influenced Thomas to feel the same way about his own little boy.
He's becoming far more strict with Arthur. He's far more punitive with him. And often, he's doing it at the behest of Tustin. So she is telling him that he needs to be stricter, that he needs to deal with this kind of behaviour in a certain kind of way, and he's going along with that. So this is a real change in the man.
While it became clear that Emma Tustin had a twisted influence on Arthur's father, it was also clear that the little boy was greatly affected, and his attitude had changed. On top of all that, Arthur's paternal grandmother found scratching injuries on Arthur's back one day, and that was the last straw. She did what any responsible person would do in that position. She called in the social service workers to investigate.
The visit by social workers only happened a day or 2 later. Those bruises couldn't have disappeared. And yet, when the social workers visited, they didn't seem to carry out a very close inspection of Arthur.
But the reason they weren't very thorough in their inspection was because on one hand, they were told that those bruises were as a result of a play fight between Arthur and another of Emma's children. It sounded plausible you could think of at that moment. But with the knowledge we have now, it is frustrating to see that nothing was done with it at the time. On the other hand, it was during the COVID-19 lockdown period, and the workers were overbooked and under a lot of pressure at the time. Besides, nothing really seemed out of place when they visited.
When the social workers came round, they saw Arthur happily playing in the paddling pool. What they didn't know was that was one of the few times that he was actually allowed out of the house.
But obviously, they'd been duped. In reality, Arthur was in the worst period of his life, as his stepmother and biological father kept treating him terribly. Later on, evidence was pulled from their private chats, and it revealed just how they felt about Arthur. The text messages shows that Emma blames Arthur's dad and even complains about how she has to take care of Arthur and how terrible he is to her. She further went on to mention that she would break things up with him if Arthur continued to stay in their lives. But what was more surprising was Thomas's response. He seemed to be edging Emma on and encouraging her even at the detriment of his own son, despite the abuse and insults on the 6-year-old.
Calls his son a weasel, and they seem to egg one another on. So she will say to Hughes the punishment that she's going to give to this poor little boy, and in response he said things like, take his neck off or just finish him.
It was now clear from these messages that Thomas and Emma were on the same page when it came to how little Arthur was to be treated. But perhaps the most heartbreaking piece of evidence comes to light in a video footage inside their house. It was the hottest day of the year at the time, and an ice cream van pulled up right outside their house. One would think that Thomas and Emma would get ice cream treats for Arthur and perhaps the other children, but Thomas went out and got 2 scones for only him and Emma. The worst part of this was that they sat on their couch enjoying the treats while Arthur was on the other end of the room, made to watch and endure in pain. It was a deeply psychological message they were sending here. I can hardly imagine how Arthur must have felt here.
It's said 6 times, and at one point we hear a little child's voice say, I'm going to give you a cuddle. And so that's a little child in the same house showing empathy to Arthur.
But just when you think it has gotten to the brink of horrifying neglect on the part of his caregivers, there is more to Arthur's tape that would shatter any heart to pieces. The voice of the other child, most likely one of Emma's biological children, shows that even a child could sense that Arthur needed attention and love at that moment, and none of the adults in the house raised even a finger to take care of him properly.
Because of their ages, an adult needs to be present as well. A little child can tell Arthur needs something, but the adults in the house at the same time don't come and give him what he needs.
From all of these pieces of evidence, there is no doubt that Arthur had been neglected and treated horribly by his dad and stepmom. But the last piece of evidence represents the sort of calm before the storm. Is the last footage of Arthur before his death. In this footage, Arthur can be seen waking up after spending the night in the living room. He appeared to be weak and fragile and stood to his feet with great difficulty. He then proceeded to pick up his bed sheets, and even for that, he was too weak. He shuffles away slowly and obviously in great pain and distress and more than emotional pain. This clip shows that Arthur was also no doubt greatly physically weak. Less than 24 hours after that clip, we see Emma talking about Arthur, how he attacks her, headbutts her, and then proceeds to hurt himself so badly that he dies in the process.
Arthur was told to sit on the thinking step. Arthur's put himself all over the floor, he's banged himself off the radiator, he's hit me, he's kicked me in the process of me trying to get him back on the thinking step. He's then gone on all fours on the floor and I've told him to get up. And I shut the door over and all I heard was a crack off the floor. He was headbutting the floor on all fours. Headbutted the floor once, said, get up, you're going to hurt yourself, I've phoned your dad. He went, I don't care. At that point he was fine. And then he dropped his head again as I've tried to bear hug him and pick him up, and he headbutted the floor 3 times.
Looks feral in this image here. You can see the glare of the eyes, but she's actually feeling disgust when she's talking about Arthur.
But that was not the only tell sign Emma unknowingly gave. As she recounts her version of the incident, more evidence points to the fact that there is more to the story than she is letting on. In the end, experts are convinced that Emma Tristan is lying tongue-in-cheek as she tries to paint Arthur as the villain of the story.
Final lie.
The last 6 months, he's battered both more kids. He's smashed this house to pieces.
She's doing a few dry sniffs and she's pretending to wipe tears, but she's trying to mimic sadness.
Regardless, Arthur died from his brain injuries and a case was afoot. But it turned out that Emma did a lot more than just beat or neglect Arthur Labinjo. Hospital tests revealed Arthur had abnormally high salt levels, and he was seen to have bruising in many areas uncommon for accidental bruising in a child. A post-mortem later revealed that Arthur had over 100 marks and bruises on his head, body, and limbs, including bruising of different ages. A number of medical experts told the court that they did not believe the injuries Arthur had could have been self-inflicted, that a child of 6 simply could not have generated enough force to have caused the fatal injury to his own head. A specialist kidney consultant said that for Arthur to have had such high levels of salt in his system, he had either ingested at least 6½ tablespoons of salt on the day he was fatally injured, which the expert couldn't see how a child would have done this, other than if he was deliberately force-fed a mix of salt and water by an adult, or that Arthur had repeatedly been poisoned with heavily contaminated food and/or water over a longer period of time. Emma Tristan was eventually found guilty of the murder of Arthur, and Thomas was found guilty of manslaughter by a jury at Coventry Crown Court. The couple also faced 4 charges of cruelty to a child. On the opening day of the trial on October 5, 2021, Tristan pleaded guilty to 1 charge of willfully ill-treating Arthur on multiple occasions by forced standing, isolation, and intimidation. In the final days of the trial, Tristan admitted a 2nd charge of child cruelty, namely assaulting Arthur on multiple occasions. However, she was also convicted of 2 further charges of cruelty by withholding food and drink and by administering salt with an intent to slowly poison Arthur. Hughes was also convicted on 2 counts of cruelty, by forced standing, isolation, and intimidation, and also by assaulting Arthur. He was cleared of murder, cruelty by withholding food and drink, and by administering salt. Finally, Emma Tristan was jailed for life with a minimum of 29 years after she was found guilty of murdering Arthur. Thomas was convicted of his manslaughter and jailed for 21 years. I wonder if they also act so tough in prison like they did to Arthur. In December of 2021, football crowds around Britain paid tribute to Arthur, who was, as we know, die-hard football fan himself.
Arthur was a huge Birmingham City fan, and one of his favourite possessions was a Birmingham shirt, and he wore it whenever he could.
Well-wishers, family, friends, and well-meaning citizens dropped notes, stuffed animals, toys, jerseys, and a lot of other items at Arthur's house and grave in their tribute to a bright child taken away too soon, and too horribly. People came out in their thousands holding placards and banners with Arthur's name and pictures on them in their bid to show solidarity for the young life snuffed out too quickly. Arthur was a beautiful little boy with a bright future. Not only will he be missed, he will live on in the memories of those who love and cherish him.
Following the verdict of my son's trial, I'd like to take this opportunity to focus on the life Arthur lived and to celebrate the little beautiful boy I knew and loved deeply. The details of Arthur's case are harrowing and incomparable.
So thank you for watching. And if you want to see more like this, then click on the video on your screen now.